finished my full front panel. So it looks something like this. So I've got the cream in the center and that mocha on either two ends there. It's just curling up there in the corner. But you can see where I did not do any increases. It's straightened out. Okay. So you're going to have something that looks like this. Yours might be a little bit bigger. Yours might be smaller, depending on your measurements, of course. So we are now going to talk about how to create your back panel, which is super easy. No increases involved, just one basic square panel. But I do want to go over the numbers you need to keep in mind. Okay, so let's have a look back at my handy dandy piece of artwork here. So as I've drawn previously, the panel that we have completed is the front. So we've got the A and the B side. The cream is in the center and that mocha is on the side. So what we know, at least for my size, don't forget, is that because we've worked up and down this way, I have done 55 rows from the V to the mocha part, 55 rows this way. So in total, I have 110 rows, okay, for that whole cream section. I then added an additional 32 rows on each side to give me the width that I was looking for. So when you add 110 rows in the center and 32 on each side, you are going to have 174 rows from one end to the other. Now, why is this important? Because to create the back panel, we want it to be the exact same width as the front, okay? Now, what's super easy about the back is no increases, right? So instead of worrying about this dip, we're just going to make one large squared panel for the back. And you can see here that I wrote 106 stitches because once we finished our increasing, we ended up having, at least I did, 106 stitches at my longest part, which is on either side. So that means to create the back panel, I'm going to need to do a chain of 106 plus 1 because we're using single crochets. And that is the number that I'm going to continue doing, 106 up and down, and I'm going to go all the way until I have 174 rows. And that way it'll match the front panel, okay? Now, a little something to keep in mind. When we did the front panel, we started in the center and did one side, then the other, and then added the other colors. And I did that specifically so that the increases would be a bit more uniform on each side. You can certainly do the same technique for the back. Like you could do your chain, foundation chain right down the center of your back, and then proceed to do 55 rows this way, and then come back and do 55 rows that way, which is actually what I'm going to do just to kind of keep a uniform look with that centered chain. Then you can come back and add an additional 32 in the mocha, 32 in the mocha, exactly like we did in the front, except with no increases. If you want to keep it even simpler, you can simply start on one of these sides, but start with the mocha color first. Do your 106 plus 1, but then proceed to do 32 rows, then change your color back to the cream, and then you're going to do 110 rows of the cream all the way across until it's time to do the mocha, and then do another 32 rows. Essentially, you want to make sure you have 174 rows. Hopefully that made sense. It is really super easy, and I'm just going to get you started just so that for those of you that are super new, just kind of gain a little bit more confidence. But I'm really confident that you guys have grasped this concept. So let's get you started on the back panel. Okay, so I am going to come back to my cream because like I said, I am going to start from the center and work out just like I did the front. So I'm going to take my cream color and I'm going to place a slip knot on my hook, and I'm going to just proceed to chain 106 chains. And again, the key here is to stay consistent. This is where sometimes things get a little bit wonky, okay? And because we're working with such a large hook for the yarn that we are working with, it's easy for the consistency to kind of go by the wayside. But just do your best. You don't want them super loose, but you also definitely don't want them tight, because remember, we've got to get this bigger hook back into the chains. Okay, so mine is looking like that. So I'll meet you when you've got your number of chains. Again, mine is 106. You will measure however many stitches you ended up having at your tallest point where your shoulders are. Okay, from your shoulder to your waist. So when you're done, I'll meet you back here. Okay, so I have done 106 chains here for my back panel, and you can see sometimes they got a little looser, sometimes they were slightly tighter. Just be careful when they get a little bit tight, because you'll have an issue getting your hook in. When you have your final stitch count, add one more, because we're going to be using single crochets. And now into the second stitch from your hook, we never count the one on your hook, we're going to insert the hook, and we are going to place a single crochet. So this project is all using single crochets. That's why it's very beginner friendly. Okay, and then that's what you're going to do all the way down to the end, is just one single crochet in each stitch. That's why I said the back panel, super easy, no increases at all. Okay, so I just kind of wanted to take you through that again. Very similar to how we started the front panel. Okay, so, and it's going to be loose and wonky and all kinds of funky things. That's okay. You probably want to be careful not to allow it to get too loose, because again, compared to your first panel, you don't want there to be such a discrepancy in the gauge. So just be really careful there, and just try your best. The chain, the foundation chain is always the trickiest part in trying to keep your consistency. So just do your best, and that's it. Okay, and so when you get down to the end, you will do what we've always done. You'll chain one, turn your work, and go back into the same stitch to single crochet and come all the way back, chain one and turn into the same stitch and go all the way back. So you're going to keep doing that back and forth, back and forth, back and forth until you have one big square to cover your back. Okay? All right, guys, that's it. Super easy. I'm setting you loose to do the back panel. Then I'll meet back here when we can talk about our sleeves. Okay, guys, so I have now finished my back panel. So it's just basically one big kind of square-ish rectangle. So it looks just like that. And I've done some pinning to my front panel. So you can see where that big, nice big V opening is. It is meant to be a kind of like slouchy, loose-fitting, almost off the shouldery top. So you may notice that it's quite a large opening, and that's a-okay. So what you want to do now is align up your pieces. And I'll just preface this by saying, it is very common that, by the time you replicate a second piece, sometimes you might notice that you're off by a stitch. Maybe one length has 106, another has 107 or 104 or 110. Don't fret. It'll all kind of work out in the end. The main thing to keep in mind is you want your top portion to line up nicely. So what I always recommend doing is start pinning your two panels along the top portion, or where it's going to lay on your shoulders. So I've pinned, so just to show you, I've pinned along the side edge, the inside edge, and the center, because when you try this on, you want to make sure that it kind of sits relatively closed off. Sometimes people just put one pin here, one pin there, and then there's a big gap. You really lose the essence of what it's really going to look like. So really just try and pin it nicely across the way. I like to use safety pins. I just find it sits easier. So that's what you want to do. You want to pin along the top on both sides. That's what I did here. And so basically then you have kind of like a tunic. At this point, I would drape this over yourself and see where you are feeling pretty comfortable with your armhole, okay? And as you notice, I've placed a pin here, okay? I would do that first, okay? So again, you are counting, make sure you count the same number of stitches from the front panel to the back panel so that they are equal, because this is really important when we start creating our sleeve, okay? Then you will do the same thing on this side. So for me, I ended up having 42 stitches from the top to where my stitch marker is. So the back panel also had to have 42 stitches so that the armhole is perfectly even. Then try it on yet again, okay? See how you like it, see how it feels. You might want a sleeve that's a little bit more snug. You might want one that has just a little bit more give. So that's where you're going to gauge your preference, okay? Once you have done that, then you can go ahead and pin the very bottom. At this point, it's not super important because that'll become more important once we seam up the side seams, we say, of our top. And that's where you may find like it might be a little wee discrepancy. Like for me, for example, I know I probably have 2 extra stitches on this side. Not going to be a super big deal. I just pinned it at the bottom right now just so I could kind of gauge to see what it's going to come out like. I'm actually pretty happy. This material drapes very lovely. So if you are looking to create a light summer attire using crochet or something that's very light in fabric, the Red Heart It's a Wrap is fantastic. The only kind of, not complaint, but maybe a request if anybody at Red Heart is listening, is to have a bigger variety of colors. That's the only thing. I wish they had a more variety in colors because this does create a beautiful fabric. Okay, so pin your shoulders and then pin where you want your armholes to be. Once you're happy with that, what you want to do now is you want to stitch your shoulders together. So now we're solidifying this. Now you can use a whip stitch or the slip stitch method. I would experiment with either or, and those of you that did our camel stitch cardigan at the end of last year, you will notice that I started with a whip stitch, but then because of that particular yarn, I ended up slip stitching at the end because I just found it sat better. I generally am usually a fan of starting off with the whip stitch first because I find it just sits a little bit, just kind of camouflages a little bit easier. So that's what I'm going to start with this yarn. I feel pretty confident about it because this is very uniform. The yarn I used in the camel stitch cardigan is what we call a roving yarn. Sometimes it's thick, sometimes it's thin. So that's why the whip stitch wasn't probably the best method. But this one is very uniform and lovely, so that's what I'm going to use, okay? So I'll take you through the beginning of whip stitching, and then you're off to the races. Now, a little something, once you've pinned it and you're getting ready to stitch, you want to turn your work inside out. So, I mean, at this point, it kind of doesn't really matter which side is the front, which side is the back, because they're exactly the same pretty much. But whatever you decide is going to be your right side, you want to turn your work inside out, and then you're going to sew along the wrong side. So for me, I actually have already done that. So this is the wrong side facing out, and I'm going to start showing you how I'm going to whip stitch my top, okay? And make sure you have the appropriate color because we've got a few colors going on here. So I know mine is kind of this mocha color, so I want to make sure that I get some of the mocha color to sew this edge. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just kind of cut a strip of this yarn that's going to give me the length I need. So I'm basically just sewing it along that color block that I did there. So I've got some of this yarn left over. So I'm just, basically I always like to kind of count 3 lengthwise with a little bit more, just in case I need some extra, okay? And then from there, I'm going to get my trusty darning needle and I'm going to feed it through. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take this pin out and find the very first stitch. So this was actually very last row here. Okay, so I'm going to insert my needle right there. So I like to pick up a few of those loops, and I'm going to match it up with the very first full stitch here in the back panel. Okay, just like that. So now I've got it together. I'm going to pull my yarn through. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to knot this here, and that will secure my point there. Okay, just like that. And one more. I like doing it in threes. There we go. So now it's going to be pretty straightforward to match up row by row, because remember we worked on our top this way. So we're just basically whip stitching the edge of the rows here together. So I'm going to start by inserting from the back to the front. So my very first row here is there. And I just want to kind of pick up a couple of those loops just like that, and then match it up with this one here. So I'm going to try not to go right into that gap. I just find it's going to pull it a little bit much. So I'm trying to find couple of the loops of the stitch, just like that. So then I pull it through just until it's nice and snug, not too tight. You don't want it to pucker or bunch, but you want it to be secure. And then I go again. So I'm always going from the back through the front and looping through. So I'm going to try and pick up a couple of loops there, just like that, and then go into the very next one in the front that matches up with it. So sometimes it does go into the open gap, but I want to try my best to find loops there. Oops. Just like that. And you can always weave that little extra tail in at the end. So hopefully you can see where the whip stitch is happening there, just like that. So again, I'm going to go in from the back, like that. See where I am? And then I just match it. See, this one's got some loops here with the front. And it's very important that you match it row by row. Because of the way we did the color block, you should have done the same number of rows in this color. So we want to end up perfectly right at the end of the color there. Okay, and in fact, I'm going to take this pin out now. So once you've got that first row kind of secured, you can actually take those pins out and just keep matching up row by row. So I'm going to do one more here with you guys, and hopefully my focus will work. So I'm just going to go in here. So this one has a bit of a gap, so I'm just going to go in there, and I'm going to match up the very next row, which is right there. Okay, just like that. Pull it through, and then just kind of get it to sit a little bit more snug. Oops, I got my tail in there. There we go. Just like that. So then when you open it up on the right side, you see, it's just blending in really, really beautifully. And that's it. That's it. That's all. So you're just going to whip stitch the first shoulder. Then you will tie a knot off and snip off your yarn. And then you are going to whip stitch the next shoulder. Same thing, snip off, tie off your yarn. And then we are going to talk about creating our sleeves. Okay, so I've sewn my shoulder panels together. So I'm just kind of turning it out right side out. So it just came out really nice. I like how that blended in beautifully. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to work on the sleeves. Now, like most of the time, we make the sleeves separately and then sew them on. And just because I want to have a little bit more continuity from the shoulder area to the sleeve, we're going to work the sleeve right onto the sewn panels. It will be opened, so we will still have to seam in the side seam and then the bottom of the sleeve at the end, which is fine. So what you want to do is once you have sewn your shoulder, so that's the wrong side out, you want to turn it so it's the right side facing forward, and that's where we're going to begin stitching directly onto the front and back panel. So they're now one piece, And so I've got my stitch marker at stitch number 42 from the shoulder, and then stitch number 42 over here. So in total, I am going to have 84 stitches going across. So now remember that this came in 3 colors. So we've got the cream color, which is our center, the mocha, which we just worked on, and then we're going to work our gray in through the sleeve. Now, before I get to the gray though, I just want to take the mocha and just kind of blend it just a wee bit into the sleeve before we go into the gray. So we're going to do about 2 rows of this mocha. So not many, but just enough to kind of give it some continuity. And so what we're going to do is, as always, you're going to place a slip knot on your hook, just like that. Okay, and then I'm going to start with this from this first stitch marker here. Okay, and I'm going to place a slip knot in that stitch right away. And then I'll take out the pin just to make sure I've got the right spot. Okay, so I'm just going to slip stitch to join right there. And now I can take out that pin. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go right back into that same stitch, and I am going to place a, first I'm going to chain 1, then I'm going to go back into that same stitch and place a single crochet. Okay, and I'm just going to work over this tail here, and this is what I'm going to do into every single stitch all the way across until I get to the next stitch marker. So I will be working all the way across, okay, just like that. So it should be blending in nicely. It's the same color. So I'm going to work all the way across. I'm going to go over this little seam here and then right to the next stitch marker. So just go ahead and do that, 1 single crochet into each stitch, and I'll meet back up with you when you've got to that stitch marker. Okay, and I'm just coming up to the last couple of stitches before that stitch marker, and that is the last one. I can just take that out now. And 1 more stitch. Okay, and so now I have 84 stitches across. So that little bump is just where I went over the seam, but as you do more rows, that will smooth out. Okay. And once you get to the end, you'll chain 1 and turn your work. And then you want to create a decrease at the beginning. So what we're going to do is we're going to insert our hook right away into that very first stitch. You'll pull up a loop. So you'll have 2 loops on your hook, and then you go immediately into the very next stitch to pull up another loop. Okay, so you have 3 loops on your hook. Now we'll yarn over and pull through all 3. So what that does is that gathers these 2 stitches and creates 1. So that's the decrease you're going to do at the beginning of every round. And then we will go down to 82 stitches. Okay, very subtle. And again, just a single crochet back into each stitch all the way across. So I'm going to meet back up with you when you have 2 stitches left in this row. Okay, and I have 2 stitches left here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch these 2 together. So I'm going to insert my hook into the very next stitch here, pull up a loop, but then I'm going to go into the very next stitch right there. I'm going to pull up another loop, and then I'm going to yarn over, pull through all 3. So that now decreased those 2 stitches to 1. And now what I have is I have 82 stitches in this row here. Okay. And now what I want to do is I want to introduce the gray color. Okay. So I am just going to snip my yarn here because the yarn is so fine. I'm just going to cut it and attach a new one. So I will turn my work though, to stay consistent. And now I'm going to introduce the gray yarn. And I'm going to place a slip knot on my hook. And I'm now going to continue where we left off here. And I'm just going to insert my hook right into that very last stitch we did. And I'm going to slip stitch to join. Just like that. And I like to work over my tails as I go, so that's what I'm going to do here. And I'm going to chain one. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to skip this stitch and I'm just going to go into the very next stitch there. So I've kind of decreased by a stitch again here. So this will be the first one. So I'm going to continue on one single crochet into each stitch. And this is pretty much what you're going to do for the length of your sleeve. We're just going to do a few decreases here and there just to get it a little bit more snug. And when you get to the end of, this is the row, this is the third row. So hopefully you can see the color change there. So at the end of row 3, when you come down to the last two stitches of this row, we're going to decrease those two together. So at the end of row 3, you're going to have 80 stitches. Okay, so go ahead and do that. And I'll take you through the next row once you get there. Okay, so I'm just at the end of my row and I've got 2 stitches left. So I'm going to do a decrease again. So I will insert into the next stitch, pull up a loop, go into the last stitch, pull up a loop there, and then yarn over and pull through all 3. So at the end of row 3, you're now going to have 80 stitches. Okay, so we can see where our sleeve is now starting to take shape from the body. Now what you're going to do is you're going to continue to repeat this until you hit row 13. So you will always chain 1, turn your work, okay, and you will always skip the very first stitch and go into the next stitch for your single crochet. So what we're doing is we're decreasing at the beginning of the row and we're decreasing at the end of every row. So you will be decreasing the number of stitches by 2 for every row. So for example, at the end of row 4, you'll have 78 stitches. At the end of row 5, you'll have 76. And it will continue decreasing by 2 until you reach 60 stitches, and this should be at the end of row 13. Now remember, I am doing this for a size medium to a large. It is meant to sit very loose and slouchy. If you are making yours smaller, that may vary for you, but I would say generally about 13 rows you want to do to decrease it. Because the opening at the top is a bit wider, I'd like it to sit a little bit more snugly as it continues down the arm, okay? So otherwise, if you don't want yours to sit snugly, what you can do is do no decreases, just keep going back and forth, back and forth. If you like a nice loose bell sleeve, you can do that. But for those of you that are following along with me with this size, I will meet you back here once you've finished row 13 and you're down to 60 stitches in your sleeve. Okay guys, so once you reach the end of row 13 and you have 60 stitches, your work should be looking something like this. So this is my top shoulder seam, and this gray, which hopefully you can see on camera, is now coming out as my sleeve. And you can see those are the decreases there and there. So if we just turn it so you can see the panel on its own, right? So here's the front panel with the V, here's the back panel. That's the shoulder seam. We are now creating our sleeve. So you should be able to see that it's kind of jutting inwards, and it is going to curl. That's natural. I guess I should turn it this way because this is the way you're actually working on it. Okay, so pull this up just like that. Okay, so you can see it's kind of veering in a little bit. So we just want to continue this for a little bit, and then we'll even things out as we get further towards the lower arm. So let's move on to row 14 through 23. So just take note, row 14 to 23. This is what we're going to do next. There's going to be a 2-row repeat here. And I'll put a little note up on the screen. Okay, so for row 14, well, at the end of row 13, you want to chain 1 and turn your work. Now, for row 14, we are not going to be doing any decreases. So we're still going to end up with 60 stitches. And so what you're going to do is you're just going to insert your hook right away into that very first stitch and single crochet. And that is what you're going to do for every single stitch all the way across. So pretty straightforward. Row 14, just continue placing 1 single crochet into each stitch. Okay, and this is my last stitch of row 14. Okay, and I still have 60 stitches, so there's no decrease here. So now we're going to go on to row 15, where we are going to decrease 1 at the beginning and 1 at the end. So as usual, you're going to chain 1 and turn your work. And now we're going to do a decrease again. So you will insert into the very first stitch, you'll pull up a loop, and then you'll insert into the very next stitch and pull up a loop. So now you're going to have 3 loops on your hook, and you'll pull through all 3. So we've now snuggled these 2 stitches into 1. We then will continue on down the row and just simply place 1 single crochet into each stitch. And I'm going to meet back up with you when you have 2 stitches left in row 15. And then we'll take it from there. Okay, and now I have 2 stitches left in my row. Okay, so I'm going to stitch these 2 together. So I'm going to insert, pull up a loop, and then I'm going to insert in that last one there. It might be a little tricky to see. And then pull up a loop. Okay, so 3 loops again, yarn over, pull through all 3. So we've now decreased the last 2 stitches at the end into 1. So at the end of row 15, we now have 58 stitches. So now our decreases will be a little bit more gradual because we are going to be decreasing every other row. So in row 14, we just did no decreases. We just did 1 single crochet into each stitch. Row 15, we decreased at the beginning and at the end. You're now going to repeat this alternating decrease until you reach row 23. So, and I'll put it up on the screen here. For row 16, there will be no decreases. So you just place 1 stitch into each stitch. You should still end up with 58 stitches. Row 17, you will decrease at the beginning of the row and at the end, so you will end up with 56 stitches. Row 18, no decreases, you'll still have 56 stitches. Row 19, you will decrease at the beginning and at the end, and you will end up with 54 stitches. Row 20, there will be no decreases, and it will still remain at 54 stitches. Row 21, you will decrease to have 52 stitches. Row 22, there will be no decreases. You will remain at 52 stitches. And at row 23, you will decrease at the beginning and at the end of that row to end up with 50 stitches. So that's the number. If you're working on my size, which is a medium to a large, you want to end up with 50 stitches at the end of row 23. Okay. Again, if you happen to end up with 51 or 49 and you followed along with me, it does happen. So don't panic. It'll be totally a-okay. The main thing you want to see is that as you continue to build the rows of your sleeves, that this shape starts, and it is going to curl, so that's natural. But it's supposed to slightly start to kind of jut in a little bit, okay? So you're going to pause the video, continue to work on rows 16 through 23 in that fashion, and I'll meet back up with you when you've completed row 23. Okay guys, so this is what my sleeve looks like so far. So here is the front panel with the V, there's the back panel, there's the shoulder seam. And so this is what the sleeve is looking like so far. You can see it's starting to come in a wee bit. And that's as much as we're going to decrease now. Because for me, the style of this pullover is to have like a snug sleeve. So we now have 50 stitches. And so now we are going to just continue doing 50 stitches back and forth of single crochets all the way across. Okay, and I am going to do mine for another 65 rows. Okay, so in total, my sleeve will have 68 rows, and I'm going to go up to 65 and gauge because I don't want it to come right down because I do want to create a ribbed cuff at the end. Okay, so you might just want to keep yours nice and plain and just have the single crochets as they are. So you may need more to go right to the end where your wrist is. Mine's going to stop just shy of my wrist there, and then we'll talk about creating the ribbed cuff. But for now, I'm just going to set you guys loose. You're going to continue doing rows and rows and rows and rows until you have the length of your sleeve that you desire. And when you're done that, I'll meet back up with you and compare notes. Okay guys, so I have done an additional 65 rows of single crochets. So you can see that there. And I've just already folded it over so you can see how the sleeve is going to merge out from the body of the top. Now I have measured this sleeve in total. Now I'm measuring it from the tip here of where the mocha begins. Because this V-neck is pretty wide, it's going to sit kind of probably slouching over my one shoulder or the other. So I know that this V here starts pretty close to my shoulder already. So when I measure that there, that is approximately 16.5 inches or 42 centimeters, okay? And so this stops maybe just about here on me because I want to create a nice long cuff, a nice ribbed cuff, which we'll talk about once we finish these sleeves. So if I open this panel like this, you see, your work actually should look like this. So there's the opening, there's the shoulder where we seamed it. And here's where we've been working up our sleeve back and forth until we've gotten to the last row. So as always, you could make your sleeve much longer if you like it to be really slouchy and then fold it over, or you can follow me exactly as I'm going along. So I just left a stitch marker here after we did our last decrease. And from the decrease, I did an additional 65 rows of single crochets. So once I fold it over, and now would be a good time also to do exactly what I'm doing, fold it over, and then actually place a few safety pins here along the side and actually try it on to see how it feels. Like if you like your sleeve snug, like you can see this is a fairly narrow sleeve because I want it to sit somewhat snug. I also know it's going to stretch a little bit, so I didn't want to already make the sleeves oversized because I'm very happy with the body being oversized, okay? So once you have that sleeve done, now you know what to do. Go over to the other side and do the exact same thing. So you can see I've left my stitch markers here. So when I open this up, see, I'm basically going to work from one stitch marker to the other back and forth. I'm going to replicate the first sleeve we did, okay? Exactly with the same decreases, etc. So go ahead and do that. It's going to take you a little while as well. Once you've finished your second sleeve, we are now ready to talk about seaming up our sides and then moving on to the finishing touches, like our sleeve cuffs, a little ridge around the neckline, and our ribbing along the bottom. Now, just before I let you go on that, when you are done your first sleeve, you want to leave a fairly long tail so that we can sew in our sleeve. Now, depending on if you're using the whip stitch or the slip stitch method, leave a lot of length. So I always like to kind of stretch my yarn once and then back up twice. And I generally will do it 3 times. But in this case, I'm going to go back and forth for about 4 times. Now, I have changed my mind sometimes. I will decide I'm going to whip stitch, and then I realize it doesn't look that great, and I decide to slip stitch the seam. So whatever you choose, both are going to be correct. It's basically whatever you like, the look that you like for you. So I'm going to snip my yarn here. Go ahead and finish your sleeve. Just make sure you leave a long enough tail. Then do the second sleeve. All right, guys, you've got some more work. So press pause, do your other sleeve, and then we'll talk about some finishing touches. Okay, guys, so I have finished both sleeves, and my work, just to open it up here. Oops, I pinned that one together. So your work will kind of look a bit of an X shape here. Okay, so there's my second sleeve here I finished. And of course I've left a nice long tail so I can sew in the seams. Here is my opening. There's my other sleeve. So now the whole, basically the whole panel of the top is complete. And I call it the whole panel because it's all attached. And so what you want to do now is you're going to fold it in half. So this is the back panel. This is the front panel here that folds down. Okay, so now you can really see that the top is taking form. So now that we folded it over, we're ready to sew, to seam up our sides. Now, I cut this long piece of this gray yarn. I realize here, once we get to this side here, we're going to have the mocha color. Now, because it's just down the sides here, I'm not going to worry about it too much. If you're really, really particular, start seaming your sleeve from the wrist, going all the way here. And once you get to that color, I would snip off that gray yarn and then continue seaming down the side with your mocha color. Again, I'm not too particular about it. It's supposed to be a very casual pullover. And if the seam does show, I kind of want it to become part of the look. So I'm not too concerned about it. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to seam up our side. And before I go any further, I have this currently facing right side out. And it's just because I wanted to show you how the sleeve folds down. As we get ready to sew everything together, you want to turn this. So this is the wrong side, and you are going to fold it with the wrong sides facing out, okay? And so you want to make sure that everything lines up nicely. And this is the beautiful thing about working projects kind of in a sideways fashion, is you don't have to go into the sides of stitches. The stitches are there waiting for you. So this is what I love about these types of projects, okay? And so that is where I can get rid of these. Okay, so let's begin. So what you're going to do is you want to start off right away with the top corner here. Now, just for the stretch of the sleeve, you will be working into the sides of stitches, but because they're single crochets, they're very easy to see. And I'm going to take you through that right now. So I'm just going to unravel my long tail here. And I'm going to get my darning needle ready. Now, the thing here is you want to be careful you don't get this tangled up because it'll be a really big pain in the butt. So just got there. Here we go. So I want to take basically my yarn. This is where I've snipped it off here. So I know that that's the first stitch here. And I want to, actually that's the last stitch I did. Now I want to find the very first stitch here. So I'm just going to turn my work this way. Okay, and then you can see The very first stitch is right there. So I'm just going to insert my needle there and then go back to where I finished, and that is the first stitch there. And I want to make sure I have 2 loops, and I'm just going to pull that through. And now very gingerly you want to pull that whole tail through, because remember, it's really long. Okay, so now it's attached. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I like working from the back to the front, so I'm just going to turn this way so that I can work from right to left. And so I just want to make sure that I'm matching up row for row. So I'm going to just come in through this one here. Okay, so that's where I just seamed in. So I'm just going to go into the side of this row here, and I'm going to match it up with that one. So I always like going from the front to the back, or from the back to the front, and pull everything in towards me, just like that. So I want to pull it a little snug, not too much. And then I go into the next one, right through here, match it up through here, and I do the exact same thing. So this is all we're doing. I'm not going to do the whole thing because it's very tedious to watch, and I trust that you guys are super quick and clever, and you can see that this is what you're going to continue to do all the way down. Okay, so just nice and easy whip stitch. If you prefer to use the slip stitch method, by all means, you are more than welcome to do that as well. And this is what you want to do from your wrist or the cuff here. I'm going to continue all the way down until I get to where my colors change. And so where my color changes is where then it'll be super easy, because I'll have stitches to work into. Now you really want to be careful here that you match each row for row over here, because if you don't, once you get here, you might get to the bottom and notice that this might happen. You'll get here and oh my goodness, you've run out of stitches on this end, but there's still stitches here. And remember, you should have an even or an equal number of stitches. If that happens, it means somewhere up here we skipped some rows here. So really, really important to take your time in this particular part of the process. You don't want to rush it, because you're going to have to pull the whole thing out if you make a boo-boo, okay? So really just take it easy, put on a nice podcast, because you will need to focus your eyes down as opposed to watching a Netflix show. Do that, take your time. You're going to seam up this side, and then you're going to come over to the other sleeve. You will do the exact same thing. And then, really exciting guys, your top will actually be put together. So you can try it on, see how you like it, see how it fits. And once you do that, now we're going to focus on doing all the finishing touches. Like we're going to do a finishing collar round with some ribbing. And then of course, I'm going to do the cuffs and the bottom trim. So the really fun stuff is just around the corner. So you're just going to have to be patient, take your time, sew up your seams, and I'll see you back here shortly.